I found out why my parents never let me visit my grandparents alone, and the truth changed the way I looked at my entire childhood. Growing up, I always thought it was strange. Every time my grandparents invited me to stay the weekend, my parents would come to, or they would make sure another relative was. If I asked to spend time with grandma and grandpa by myself, the answer was always no. They never explained why, and whenever I pushed for answers, they would just say it was complicated. At first, it thought they were being overprotective, but I got older. The rule never changed. Even when I was a teenager old enough to travel on my own, my parents still refused to let me visit my grandparents without supervision. It became one of those family mysteries nobody wanted to talk about. The strange part was that my grandparents seemed completely normal. They were kind. They bought me gifts, remembered every birthday, and always told me how much they loved me. Nothing about them seemed dangerous or unusual, which my parents' behavior even more confusing. Whenever the family got together, I noticed tension between my parents and grandpa, but nobody ever argued openly. It was all hidden beneath polite smiles and awkward conversations. Then, when I was 23 years old, my grandmother passed away. The funeral brought relatives together from all over the country, and for the first time, I started hearing stories about the family that nobody had ever told me before. Late that evening, after most people had gone home, I was sitting with one of my older cousins when the conversation turned to childhood memories. He casually mentioned something about how lucky I was that my parents had protected me. I immediately asked what he meant. The look on his face told me he had assumed I already knew. When I said I had no idea what he was talking about, he became quiet and looked uncomfortable. Then he told me a story I was never supposed to hear. Years before, my grandfather had struggled with severe anger problems. According to my cousin, there were incidents nobody in the family liked, discussing explosive outbursts, broken furniture, screaming matches, and moments that frightened everyone around him. Several relatives had stopped visiting altogether because of his behavior. Eventually, my grandfather got help, and over time, he changed. He became calmer, kinder, and more stable. By the time I was born, most of those problems were years in the past, but my parents remembered they had seen the worst parts of him. And while they believed he had changed, they never completely trusted that the anger was gone. Suddenly everything started making sense. The supervision, the rules, the constant presence of another adult. My parents were not trying to keep me away from my grandparents. They were trying to make sure I was never alone if something went wrong. I still felt confused because the grandfather I knew had never shown any signs of being dangerous. So a few weeks later, I decided to talk to my father directly. At first, I did not want to discuss it, but eventually he sat down and told me the full story. He described growing up in a house where everyone walked one's hells, never knowing what might trigger an explosion. Never knowing whether a small mistake would turn into a terrifying argument. He said his childhood taught him lessons she wished he never had to learn. Then looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Your grandfather became a much better man later in life, but I could never risk finding out the hard way that the old version was still hiding somewhere inside him." That sentence has stayed with me because it was not about hat red. It was about fear carried for decades, a fear strong enough to shape how I raised his own child. For the first time, I understood how complicated family can be. People can change, people can improve, people can become completely different from who they once were. But the people who lived through their worst moments do not always forget. Even when forgiveness exists, trust can take much longer to return.